The Registry of Viable Minds had existed long before most civilizations learned to count their own dead. It occupied no single place, existed on no single world, and answered to no single authority except the doctrine it had built across 11,000 years of careful, meticulous work. Its purpose was elegant in its simplicity. Every mind that reached a sufficient level of development would eventually come before the registry, and the registry would measure it, classify it, and assign it a standing in the great cosmic ledger of intelligence. Not out of arrogance, out of order. The universe, the registry had long believed, functioned best when everything within it knew precisely where it stood. Chief Assessor Verindel had spent 412 years conducting these evaluations, and in that time she had never once encountered a result she could not explain. Her species, the Aelhuri, processed thought the way rivers processed water, continuously, smoothly, along established channels that deepened with age and never once reversed direction. She was considered among the finest minds her civilization had produced, and the registry had recruited her accordingly, placing her at the apex of its evaluation division where the most complex cases arrived. She had assessed the crystalline hive thinkers of the Morath expanse, whose thoughts moved in geometric storms that took decades to fully interpret. She had evaluated the deep-time philosophers of Ulsoth, whose individual cognition stretched across centuries, so slow and vast they resembled weather systems more than thinking. She had even assessed the Pale Choir, a species with no individual minds at all, only a collective resonance that rose and fell like tides. Each had challenged her. None had defeated the framework. Then came the human. Her name was Mara Chen. She arrived at the registry's assessment station aboard a small diplomatic vessel, the third of her kind ever to undergo formal cognitive evaluation, though the previous two had been classified without incident in the lower middle tiers of the registry's vast intellectual hierarchy. Nothing in their files had prepared Verindel for Mara. The preliminary intake scan had been unremarkable. Processing speed measured at 312 standard units, placing her comfortably within the lower half of the registry's scale. Memory recall showed acceptable precision with notable degradation under retrieval pressure. Pattern recognition scored adequately but inconsistently, with unpredictable spikes that the intake technicians had flagged as possible sensor noise and then quietly dismissed. Emotional processing occupied an unusually large portion of her cognitive architecture, which the registry had historically classified as inefficiency. Logical throughput was modest. Attention bandwidth, measured against the Aelhuri baseline, was frankly narrow. Verindel reviewed the file with the mild interest she reserved for lower-tier assessments and scheduled a standard 2-session evaluation. She expected no surprises. She received something that would, in the cycles that followed, force her to question every assumption the registry had ever committed to doctrine. The first session began in the White Chamber, a room designed to feel like nothing at all, walls smooth and neutral, air temperature precisely calibrated, light distributed without shadow or source. Mara entered wearing a plain gray suit and carried nothing except a small worn object she had asked permission to keep, a smooth flat stone that had come, she explained simply, from a river near the house where she had grown up. Verindel had allowed it. It seemed irrelevant. The first test was pure pattern recognition. A sequence of 340 nested logical structures appeared simultaneously on the chamber wall, each one a problem complete unto itself, each one also a fragment of a larger architecture that, when solved together, revealed a single underlying truth. The registry used this test because it revealed not just how fast a mind worked, but how it prioritized, how it chose where to place its attention when everything demanded attention equally. Most species attacked the problems in order, working through each one systematically, their scores reflecting the efficiency of their sequencing. The highest-ranking minds identified the underlying architecture almost immediately and solved outward from the center, finishing in a fraction of the time. Mara sat down on the floor. Verindel, watching through the observation layer, noted this with mild surprise. The chair was there. The human ignored it and sat cross-legged on the white floor, the stone in her left hand, and looked at the wall for a long time without doing anything at all. 40 seconds passed. Verindel felt the first ghost of impatience. Then Mara began working, not from the center, not from the beginning, but from a point in the lower left quadrant that appeared, by any structural analysis, completely arbitrary. She solved that problem. Then she skipped to a position near the top right. Then back to the middle. Then sideways. Her path through the 340 problems looked, on the tracking display, like something a child had drawn without lifting the pen, curved and doubling back and wandering. And yet she was moving. She was not slow, exactly. She was not fast. She was something else, something the tracking system had no clean word for, because her speed was not constant. There were moments where she paused entirely, eyes closed, stone turning slowly in her fingers, and the system registered nothing, no cognitive output, no measurable processing, just a human sitting still with her eyes shut. And then she would open her eyes and solve 3 problems in rapid succession as if she had been solving them in the silence. It took her 9 minutes and 40 seconds to complete the full sequence. The registry average for a mind of her processing class was 6 minutes, 11 seconds. She was slower than expected, but not dramatically. Verindel noted the result with mild disappointment and prepared to move to the next phase. Then the analysis completed. Mara's solution path, the wandering chaotic line that had looked like random movement, had solved every problem in an order that minimized total cognitive load across the sequence. Not just for her. For any mind. The registry's algorithms ran the comparison 3 times before Verindel trusted the result. The optimal path through 340 simultaneous nested logic structures, the path that the registry's own theoretical models had identified as ideal but had never observed any evaluated species actually walk, was the path Mara Chen had walked. Not because she had calculated it. The calculation itself would have required more processing power than she demonstrably possessed. She had found it. Some other way, by feel, by intuition, by whatever happened in the silence with the stone turning in her fingers, and the registry had no framework that explained it. Verindel ordered an immediate anomaly review and continued the session. The second test was designed to assess cognitive stability under emotional disruption. The registry had developed it after observing that many species with exceptional logical capacity showed significant degradation when presented with information that carried emotional weight. Grief, fear, guilt, love, these were known disruptors of clean thinking, and the registry measured how cleanly a mind could partition them away from its reasoning function. The test was straightforward. Mara would be presented with a complex navigational problem requiring sustained concentration, and simultaneously the chamber would play audio recordings, sounds of distress, voices calling for help in her own language, the kind of sounds her species was biologically conditioned to respond to. The test would measure how much her problem-solving degraded under the emotional load. The recordings began. Voices filled the chamber, low at first, then louder. Mara's face changed. Verindel watched it happen through the observation layer and felt something she could not immediately name. The human's expression did not go blank, as many species managed. It did not harden into the controlled mask of deliberate suppression. It did precisely the opposite. Mara's face opened. Her jaw tightened slightly. Something moved behind her eyes that looked, from where Verindel stood, uncomfortably like pain. She did not partition the emotion away. She did not seem to try. She simply held it, openly, visibly, and kept working. Her processing speed dropped 14%. Verindel expected it to keep dropping. It didn't. At 40 seconds, the drop stabilized. At 60 seconds, it began to reverse. By 90 seconds, Mara's measured cognitive throughput had returned to its baseline. By 2 minutes, it had exceeded baseline by 11%. She was solving the navigational problem faster under emotional distress than she had solved comparable problems in the neutral environment. Not because she had suppressed the emotion. The biological indicators were clear. Her cortisol was elevated. Her heart rate had increased. The distress signals were landing and she was feeling them. She simply was not letting them take the wheel. She had put the pain somewhere it could ride along without driving, and whatever that place was, the registry had no name for it. The navigation problem completed. The recordings faded. Mara sat still for a moment with her eyes closed, the stone pressed flat against her palm, and Verindel saw her lips move silently around words she couldn't hear. Then Mara opened her eyes and looked directly at the observation layer, as if she somehow knew where Verindel was standing, and said, quietly, "Those were recordings, weren't they? Real ones?" Verindel did not answer. She was staring at the data. The third test was the one Verindel had never seen produce an anomaly in 400 years of assessment. It was called the dissolution problem, and its name was accurate. The registry had constructed it to identify the hard ceiling of any mind's capacity, the point where complexity finally exceeded processing ability and cognition simply dissolved, like a bridge asked to carry more weight than its materials could hold. It worked by presenting an interconnected series of problems that each required solutions from the others to be solved, a recursive loop with no clean entry point, a knot with no loose end. The problems scaled in difficulty as the assessment proceeded, and the registry's models predicted with precision how long any given class of mind could sustain engagement before dissolution. The test had a 0 failure rate. Every mind that had ever faced it had eventually stopped. Some stopped quickly. Some lasted impressively long. All stopped. The dissolution point was, in the registry's foundational doctrine, the truest measure of a mind's upper limit. Mara looked at the opening configuration for a long moment and then said, "This is designed to not be solvable, isn't it?" Verindel, against protocol, activated the communication channel. It is designed to identify the limit of sustained cognitive function. Mara nodded slowly. But the way it's built, solving one part breaks another part. It's not a puzzle. It's a drain. That is an adequate characterization, Verindel said. Mara looked at it for another moment. Okay, she said, and began. The registry's models predicted dissolution for a mind of her class at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. At 11 minutes, she showed the expected signs. Her processing speed was degrading. Her error rate was climbing. The recursive loops were doing exactly what they were designed to do, eating the edges of her cognition, pulling resources away from solutions as fast as she could generate them. Verindel watched the graphs with the calm attention of someone observing a familiar conclusion approaching at its expected pace. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Mara stopped moving. Not dissolution. Not cognitive failure. She stopped deliberately, put the stone down on the floor in front of her, pressed both hands flat against her knees, and closed her eyes. The system registered nothing. No cognitive output. No processing throughput. Nothing. 30 seconds of silence. Verendel's hand moved toward the termination control and then hesitated. Mara opened her eyes. She picked up the stone. She looked at the dissolution problem on the chamber wall, and then she did something that made the registry's analysis systems generate an error code Verindel had never seen in 4 centuries of work. She stopped trying to solve it. Not in the sense of giving up. In the sense of reframing what solving meant. Instead of attacking the recursive loop directly, she began mapping it, tracing the shape of the knot rather than trying to untie it, finding not the solution but the structure that made solution impossible, and then, slowly, carefully, the way someone might walk a path they can feel but not see, she began describing what a solution would have to look like if one existed. She was not solving the unsolvable problem. She was building a map of the territory where its solution would live, if the problem's own structure would allow it, and she was doing so with the full knowledge that it wouldn't, and she was doing it anyway, because the map itself was valuable, because understanding the shape of an impossible thing was not nothing, it was something, it was in fact everything that could be done, and she was going to do everything that could be done rather than nothing, rather than stop. The dissolution problem consumed her for 29 minutes. The registry model had predicted 11:40. When the session timer finally ended by protocol limit, not by failure, the chamber systems had generated 47 error flags and the analysis engine had frozen twice. Mara sat in the white room with sweat on her forehead and the stone still in her hand and looked, not defeated, not triumphant, just quiet and present and finished. She looked up at the observation layer again. "Did I get anything right?" she asked. Verindel did not speak for a long moment. She was looking at a field on her display that had never, in 412 years, shown anything except a number. It showed something else now. A word she had not known was in the system's vocabulary. Undefined. Verindel convened a review panel 6 days later, in the registry's deliberation hall where assessments were finalized and classifications became permanent. She stood before colleagues who had spent centuries trusting the framework she was now asking them to question, and she showed them everything. The wandering path that was the optimal path. The emotional disruption that had amplified rather than degraded. The dissolution session that had refused to dissolve. One colleague, a renowned assessor named Felivorn, whose species had contributed heavily to the registry's foundational methodology, spoke first with a careful tone of someone managing disbelief. "The model has held for 11,000 years, he said. "I know," Verindel replied. "You are suggesting the model has a blind spot." "I am suggesting the model assumes that a mind's ceiling is the point where it can no longer function effectively. And I am suggesting that this human does not treat that point as a ceiling." Silence settled over the hall. Another colleague, an ethicist named Sorvin who rarely spoke during assessment reviews, leaned forward. What does she treat it as? Verindel thought for a moment before answering. A floor, she said. The point from which a different kind of thinking begins. The hall absorbed that slowly. Felivorn pressed further. Then she is more intelligent than her processing scores suggest. Verindel shook her head. She is not more intelligent by our measurement. Her processing speed is what it is. Her logical throughput is what it is. She is not secretly a high-tier mind in low-tier packaging. She paused. She is something the tier system was not designed to describe. When the problem is solvable, she is adequate. When the problem is impossible, she becomes something we don't have a category for. Not because she solves the impossible, she doesn't, but because she refuses to treat impossibility as a reason to stop engaging with it. Sorvin spoke again, very quietly. Then we have been measuring intelligence by what it cannot do. And she has shown us that some minds define themselves by what they do after the cannot. The hall was silent for a long time. The registry was not an institution that moved quickly to discomfort. But the data did not yield to the discomfort of those reading it. It simply sat there, patient and clear, exactly as anomalous as it had been in the White Chamber. In the end, the panel reached consensus in the way institutions sometimes do, not enthusiastically, not with any of the relief that comes from a clean answer, but with the particular gravity of people who have found something true and must now live with the weight of it. Mara Chen's classification field was updated. Not to a tier. Not to a ranking. The field simply read, in the registry's precise, formal language, standard metrics insufficient. Performance characteristics extend beyond modeled parameters under conditions of sustained difficulty. Classification deferred indefinitely. Do not apply ceiling assumptions. Verindel met Mara in a corridor near the assessment station's viewing gallery the following morning. The gallery looked out over a sweep of open space, a dark and enormous quiet that both of them regarded in silence for a moment before either spoke. The registry has reached its decision, Verindel said. Mara turned from the window. Am I being sent home? You are being marked as unclassifiable, Verindel said. That is not a dismissal. It is an acknowledgement that our framework does not contain you. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That sounds lonely. Verindel considered that. It was not the response she had expected. Does it concern you? A little, Mara said honestly. But I'm used to problems that don't have clean endings. She looked back out at the dark. I've spent a lot of time sitting with things I couldn't solve. You get comfortable with it eventually. The staying in it. Verindel looked at her. During the dissolution session, when you stopped and closed your eyes. What were you doing? Mara turned the stone over in her hand, a habit so automatic she seemed unaware of it. Remembering why it mattered, she said. When something gets too hard, sometimes the only way to keep going is to go back to the reason. Not the method. The reason. Once I had that back, the method could follow. She paused. Even if the method couldn't actually get there. Even if it was impossible. The reason was still real. So the trying was still real. Verindel looked at her for a long moment. 412 years of assessment, and she had never heard a mind describe its own deepest function so simply and so accurately. You are aware, Verindel said at last, that the registry will need to revise doctrine. Mara smiled slightly. That seems like a big job. It is, Verindel said. We have been measuring intelligence by what it produces in optimal conditions. You have demonstrated that some minds produce their most important things in the worst conditions, things the metrics were never calibrated to catch. Mara was quiet again, looking out at the dark beyond the glass. Every person I know does that, she said finally, not boasting, not making a point, just telling the truth the way people do when they haven't thought about something hard enough to perform it. Everyone I've ever admired. They weren't impressive when things were easy. They were impressive when things were completely impossible and they stayed anyway and found something in the staying. She pressed her thumb against the smooth surface of the stone. I think that's actually the only kind of impressive that matters. Verindel stood beside her and looked out at the same dark, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that her species' language had a word for, but that the registry's vocabulary had quietly lost across 11,000 years of careful classification. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something genuinely unknown, not with the anxiety of a framework failing, but with the much older, much more honest feeling of a mind encountering something it had not yet learned to hold. She didn't have a word for Mara Chen. She didn't have a tier, a rank, a scale, a model. She had only the data, patient and strange and clear, and the knowledge that the absence of a category was not the same as the absence of a truth. In the registry's archive, in the long quiet record of every mind that had ever been assessed, a single entry sat different from all the others, its classification field carrying not a number but a note, plain and permanent, entered by Chief Assessor Verindel on the day the framework first admitted what it could not hold. The note read, "Some minds are not defined by the height of their reach in stillness, but by the depth of their refusal to let go when everything has already told them they are done. We have no measurement for this. We have only the evidence of it, and the evidence is enough. Do not assume a ceiling. Do not assume an end. Record only what you observe, and observe carefully, because this kind of mind does its most significant work precisely where your instruments stop reading." Outside the gallery window, the dark went on as it always had, enormous and patient and full of things that had not yet been named, waiting, as unmeasured things always wait, for someone willing to stay in the difficulty long enough to find them.